Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in to the official 2022 College Football Awards, the worst of 2022. Now, guys, I just wanted to do a little fun thing, giving out my worst awards here, and then maybe tomorrow I'll do the best of 2022. But I think I've got like 12 or 13 different things I want to talk about in terms of the absolute worst of college football in 2022. The worst game award, it goes to week one all the way back. It's got to be South Dakota State at Iowa, the 7-3 game. You've got South Dakota State's quarterback, 26 pass attempts, 87 yards. You've got Iowa scoring 4 points in the second half. How about South Dakota State with 6 first downs in the entire game? I mean, Iowa had 10. They had 16 combined first downs. It is kind of a shame because South Dakota State ended up being a really good team, but this game, horrifically bad. It gets worst game of the year award all the way back to week one due to the horrible offense combined with the safeties. Next, we've got the worst coach award, and for everything, it just has to be Jimbo Fisher. This was a tight battle between Jimbo and Mario Cristobal, both of the NIL dumpster fire. You can take a look at the overall season for A&M. I actually warned people that Texas A&M was not going to be as good as people think they're going to be this year because they had a bunch of true freshmen. But guys, even I didn't think they were going to be this bad. Looking back at the App State loss week 2, App State didn't even make a bowl game. So App State won that game and still only had 5 wins. They beat Miami, which is kind of funny. Then they beat Arkansas in a neutral site game. They get crushed in 2 straight games. Then they lose to South Carolina. Just overall a really boring football team. And Jimbo Fisher right now, everyone's been talking about the lack of innovation on offense. Who will they bring in to try and right the ship there? They spent all this money on the recruiting class. Did it backfire on them? Are they having locker room issues? They're losing transfer portal guys left and right, but I do think they've been able to keep together at least most of their 2022 crazy elite recruiting class. You're going to want to see those guys grow, but that was a terrible year for Jimbo Fisher, a team that was inside the top 10, didn't even make a bowl game, and that's with getting a free win against UMass towards the end of the season, and also upsetting LSU. Otherwise, they would have been 4-8 on the year. The worst offense, it's got to go to New Mexico. Just an absolute horrible team. You can take a look at their third down efficiency. They were 35 of 159 on third down. 22% conversion rate, 13 total points per game. Any metric will say, they were the worst offense pound for pound in the FBS. That includes all the bad teams. It includes FIU. It includes Iowa's offense. Surprisingly enough, New Mexico, and you can just take a look, their quarterbacks combined for a grand total of 3 touchdowns. Their leading quarterback had 800 passing yards on the season. And this is like their final, you take a look at their final, 8 games? 14 points, 9 points, 9 points, 10 points, 3 points, 10 points, and then the Mona Lisa getting shut out by Colorado State on Black Friday. It is unfortunate. It really is. Going to the worst quarterback, it is Brady Olson. Now, some of this, unfortunately, is just, he's playing for UMass. If he played for another school that had a better offense, this kid might be better. I really don't want to kill him. But 2 passing touchdowns, 8 interceptions, under 800 yards. You take a look at his game log, 50% completion percentage. He was, at least statistically, pound for pound, the worst quarterback. Although I did see a recent tweet talking about Haynes King, the former Texas A&M quarterback, who I think was like a top 100 recruit, and they showed his throwing motion. And just because of me looking at his throwing motion, it almost makes me want to put Haynes King, the Texas A&M transfer, as the worst quarterback this year. To be honest, I mean, it is horrible, but it has to go to Brady Olson. UMass is horrifically bad every single year. They're one of, if not the worst teams in FBS. Worst performance, it's got to be Billy Atkins versus Marshall. It's a sad story here with James Madison at this point. They were 5-1 coming into this game. They were favorites in it. And you've got Billy Atkins, the quarterback, 13 of 35, 164, 1 touchdown, 4 interceptions, but it actually gets worse for Billy. He had 13 carries for negative 23 yards with the sack yardage added in there, so it was a horrific performance, and all the QBR, all the metrics say this was the worst performance, bar none, at least that we can measure according to the quarterbacks. He gets the award for that. Worst running back, this is a sad story. It's going to be Lew Nichols, who actually led college football in rushing last year. I don't think this is really his fault, but it was just not good. I mean, you want to talk about 176 attempts, 600 yards, averaging 3.5 yards per carry in the MAC. It's just horrible. And then some game logs. You could take 6 carries for 20 yards against Eastern Michigan, 31 carries for 97 yards, 18 carries for 32 yards at Toledo. He actually had a decent game at Penn State. I remember that game. For Central Michigan was in that game, I remember. And then he really padded his stats versus FCS Bucknell. Even the game where they scored 44 points week 1 at Oklahoma State, just 2.8 yards per carry. So, I'm sure a lot of it was his line not blocking, but he was a really bad running back in terms of the volume that he got. And the worst wide receiver award, it's going to go to Jaden McGowan, who, this is crazy. A receiver with 6 fumbles, and on top of it, he didn't even have 500 yards. So it is remarkably bad, unfortunately, for him. And because he had the 6 fumbles, not a great yards per catch, under 10 yards, I believe, in terms of that for Vanderbilt. So he has to be the worst wide receiver. The worst defense, it's got to be South Florida. And South Florida, allowed the most yards per game, 516. But it's not only that. Take a look at their last 6 games. They allowed 45, 42, 54, 41, 48, 46 points. Just absolutely terrible performances. Of course, the worst performance there is a game against Temple. Temple does not have a good offense, and they gave up 54 points. They finished 1-11 on the year. They were the worst defense, in my opinion, in the FBS. Moving on to the worst performance overall, we got to go with the 73-0 epic shellacking. It's Florida International. They lost by 73 points. What more can you say? You can't be losing by 73. By far, that was the biggest differential in any game between 2 FBS teams, so they got to be on the list. The worst transfer, it's going to be Jaleel Billingsley going to Texas. And guys, he was the number 24 overall kid in the portal, had a 93 solid 4-star rating, and he basically got kicked off of Texas. It was an absolute train wreck. I think there were reports that they just said, you're done. That's a situation where if Nick Saban, who needs pass catchers, is willing to let a kid go, it should probably trigger some red flags. If you're Steve Sarkisian, maybe that's a lesson for the next time you try and take a transfer. I don't know. Worst recruit, sad story here. It's going to be Eric Gilbert, the number 1 overall tight end in history back in 2020. Currently with Georgia. He's been injured. He hasn't played. He has 2 catches for 16 yards. This is the highest rated tight end that's ever been rated in recruiting. A lot of people don't know that. It is a, unfortunate situation. I think he's transferred a few times. I believe he did sign with LSU and then immediately transferred back home to Georgia. But he does have Brock Bowers in front of him. But this is what, your second year? You're the highest rated tight end in history and you've got 16 yards. It is what it is, guys. Worst overall point spread. It's going to be the last week of the regular season. Liberty, 24-point favorites over New Mexico State. They lose outright, but not only do they lose, they get annihilated. So they were 24-point favorites at home, and they lost by 35. Of course, a lot of this situation was the whole Hugh Freeze thing. How about the whole Hugh Freeze timeline? That Hugh Freeze, I think, signed an 8-year extension like in September or October, and he's already left Liberty. It's hilarious, but that was a terrible spread in terms of the worst spread. And then I would just say another possible worst spread would be Alabama -9 at Tennessee, when we all thought that was a ridiculous spread and Tennessee ended up winning the game. That would be the other one. But this one, by far, in terms of just the epicness of it, is really bad. Worst second half team, it has to be Syracuse, who completely fell on their face in the second half of the season. You can see they start off 6-0, getting a top 15 win versus NC State. They lose to Clemson. Okay, it's understandable. You were in the game. You lose to Notre Dame at home. That's not great. You score 9 points at Pittsburgh. You get destroyed by FSU. It's completely off the rails at that point. They were able to rebound on the road and beat Boston College, but still, you start 6-0 and you finish 1-5. Not a good second half for them at all. The worst loss, we have to go with Tennessee, giving up 63 points to South Carolina, when realistically, if they won out, they would have a chance to make the playoff. Of course, a lot of that hinges on the Hendon Hooker injury, but you're giving up 63 points. South Carolina scored so many points, they ran out of fireworks to shoot off after they scored the last touchdown. It is remarkable. Other really bad losses, definitely the USC loss when they could have made the playoff against Utah, considering they already lost to them once. The Ohio State loss to Michigan, but they still ended up making the playoff, so that's why I didn't include that. The Alabama 1-point loss in overtime on the road at LSU, where if they win out, they're in the SEC championship game because LSU ends up losing to Texas A&M. Those are just a few other ones, but I had to go with Tennessee losing, and giving up 63 points to South Carolina. The worst Power 5 conference in my eyes, the ACC. They had one team inside the top 10. They had two teams inside the top 24. I mean, just look at how many teams: 39, 43, 45, 48, 52. That's a Power 5 conference with 4 teams ranked 80th or lower. That is just not good for the ACC. Unfortunately, they were the worst Power 5 conference. The Big Ten had the Big Three. They're never going to be of course, the Big Ten West was a horrible division, but when you've got Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, 3 of the top 10 or 11 teams, you're not going to be the worst. The SEC, just with their talent, they're never going to come close to it. And then you're taking a look at the Big 12, a lot of parity in that conference. No great teams, but they did have a really good team in TCU that ended the season kind of being a semi-great team, and you've got a bunch of teams that are solid and no team really below like the bottom 60. And then you also have the Pac-12, which was a surprisingly good conference this year. Even with no playoff teams, it's very clear the ACC, with Clemson, dealing with their quarterback situation. FSU finished the season really strong. I mean, after those two teams, my God, is that a bad conference? Oh, my goodness. Next, we have the worst bowl team, and it has to be New Mexico State. Guys, New Mexico State actually made a bowl by beating Liberty. That game I just talked about is 24-point underdogs. And then they scheduled Valparaiso, the FCS school. I didn't even know Valparaiso had a football team. We remember the Valparaiso team, the Horizon League for college basketball. That's what I remember them as. But they apparently have a football team. And then they crush Valparaiso and they end up making a bowl. So congratulations to New Mexico State, who quite frankly the past few years has at least been in the conversation with UMass and UConn for the worst team in the FBS. But this year they were a little bit better, not by much, but they did make a bowl and go 6-6. So guys, that's going to do it for my official worst of 2022. Just some fun little awards I thought I would do with it being the end of the regular season. Make sure you're following me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description. I'm, of course, the Depressed Ginger. Thank you for watching.